Hello everybody, thank you all for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to show you a few different techniques that we have with CSS for doing layouts. In particular, with doing layouts with rows and columns. So without further delay, let's dig into the code. Okay, so I have a CodePen sample here showing just a basic CSS layout here with 6 images, as you can see, 3 columns and 2 rows. And I brought those in via Unsplash. Those are the URLs for these images here. Just got 6 image tags in just a basic modular layout here. And there's a link to this CodePen in the description below. But I want to dig in a little further here. I want to show you the CSS code that was written for this. So we're importing a font here of Roboto, just to set this up. And I'll just size this real quick here just so you can kind of see everything on here. So then I just have a simple section tag, which is surrounding this whole thing. It's setting the whole background image here, this little thing of outer space, just to, give kind of a cool look here. And then pretty much universal global styling here, just for, basic styling of these images, and also for the text as well. And then images like I was saying, and then also for these buttons down here. Now, if we scroll down a little further, there's a section here for the different type of layout tools that we have. And to make it a little easier to kind of show the difference between the different layouts, I've set this little set layout mode thing, which is just a little select option tool. And you'll notice there's 3 different kinds. There's float, there's flexbox, and there's grid. And this CSS that you see here, this CSS corresponds to doing a layout with floats, one for doing flexbox, and the other for doing grid. Now I want to start with the first type of layout that we can do with CSS. I'm going to just get this right here just so you can see this top part. I've also set it here, so whatever mode you set here for the layout will also show there as well. The first one is floats. Now, floats were originally intended for making text wrap around images. However, they were also used for doing layouts as well. So the CSS right here, I've got a float container, which basically gets dynamically inserted via JavaScript right in here. I can actually show you that in the developer tools here in Chrome. Let's see, right up here. So you can notice that this one shows float container, and then for all these items, you also notice it's got a class of float item for the items as well for each of the images in the layout. Now, if I change between float and flexbox, you notice the class name changes. That's just a way to switch between the different modes a little more easy. Just kind of wanted to show you that real fast before we dig a little further here into floats. Okay, so I'm going to expand this just so we can see more of the CSS since we're talking about floats here. So I've got the CSS here for the float container. You saw what I was showing just a little bit ago of where that's being applied, and then the float items for each of these. Let me expand this back out again real quick. So I have a float left applied to each of these, and then a width of 33.33%, which if you take that times 3, that gives you 100%, so then that gives you 3 columns. And then, of course, a little padding with a variable here that's up here, a gap of 40 pixels. And then also with floats, because floats are intended for having things wrap around it, you want to apply a clear to it. So after all these are done, the parent container has sort of an after pseudo element to clear that out, so then everything else past this point will just stack down below it. So if I take this and shrink the window, or the viewport window, you notice how at certain points they will go from 3 columns wide to 2 columns wide to 1 column wide. Now, the reason this is happening is because I've set these media queries here. So right at 1266 pixels, I tell each of the float items to take up 50%, which makes it obviously 2 columns wide. And then at 840 pixels, they take up 100% width, so then it all stacks into one column. So that, for the most part, is pretty much how you do floats. So you do have to do a little bit of math here, and you got to apply a little bit of padding, and then you got to do this sort of clear of the floats to make sure that stuff doesn't wrap up in behind it. Especially if I do something like this to hide the last element. If you don't clear, you could have stuff wrapping in here, just given the way the float property works, since it was intended for having text wrap around it. And then you also have this border here just to kind of show the parent container that it's wrapped under, just to show that it's taking up most of the space. Now, one thing to note with doing floats for layouts, that's not really a recommended way of doing layouts anymore. That was the way they used to do things on older websites back before they had Grid and Flexbox. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of problems with layouts, with things not lining up correctly, because floats were never really intended for doing layouts in the first place. But back before they had Flexbox and Grid, they didn't really have many other options for doing things in rows and columns. But I just want to show that to you guys so you know what to do in case you have to do any changes or anything on an older website, and give you an idea of how float-based layouts work. So let's get back into the code. Okay, so moving on to the next type of layout tool that we have in CSS is Flexbox. Now, Flexbox came in and solved a lot of the problems that were going on with floats, and it was actually the first type of CSS tool designed for doing layouts, or more specifically, being able to do, say, 3 columns or do a stack of rows, and being able to get things to line up a little more easily, per se. So I'll go down here and just show you the Flexbox CSS. So you've got that Flexbox container that's being dynamically applied, like we showed earlier in the dev tools with the JavaScript here. And for the Flexbox container, which is wrapping around all these images, we give it a display flex. Now I also give it a flex wrap of wrap. And the reason I applied that is if I take that off, now it's going to try to fit everything in a row, which is what Flexbox does by default. So now everything is just, they're all in columns in one row, and obviously we're running into overflow issues. So I set the flex wrap to wrap on that for that reason. And then justify content center, that just makes sure the elements remain in the center. In this case, they're taking up all the space, so it doesn't really do too much difference, but hey, it doesn't hurt to have it. And then, of course, setting a gap here, just 40 pixels between these. And then on the individual items themselves, I'm giving it a flex 1, which controls how much it grows and shrinks. And then also giving it a width using this min property, which takes in 2 parameters, one being one size and one being the other, and it will take the smallest of the 2. Now the item min width that I've set on here, it's actually up here, is 360 pixels, meaning I don't want these images or these items here in this Flexbox container to get any smaller than 360. If for some reason it runs out of room, then that will start stacking, or in this case go down to 2 columns. And then if it can't keep these at 360s at a certain point, or 360 pixels, then it will just stack. A lot like what you're doing with the floats, but if you notice here, we didn't have to write as much CSS like we did on floats, because we're not having to get all hacky. Flexbox is written a little more for doing layouts. Now, going back to this flex 1 property that I briefly touched on, I mentioned that it controls how much these items will grow and shrink. Now, I want to take that off real quick. I'm just going to comment it out. And you notice that now on the sides, these aren't filling up as much anymore. And when I shrink the window down, they're not, filling in the whole space of the parent container. The reason that's happening is because when I took this flex 1 off, it's no longer applying a grow or shrink method to it. And with this width here, with the min, it's set to only go up to a maximum of 360 pixels, which is what's happening here. But if I turn that back on, put it back to the way it was before, now those items will grow and fill in that extra space. Or in this case, their widths and heights will increase in order to fill from end to end while still maintaining a gap in between. So I want to bring it back here. And then what I'm going to do, and this is something that's going to be a little different compared to what you saw with floats, is I'm going to do hide sixth item. I'm going to click this button here and watch what happens. You can see that these last two items on the second row here have gotten significantly bigger. They've essentially grown to fill in the extra space that's been made available to them, because when I take this off, then they just go back to all being the 360 pixels that I defined here for the max length. And then they just kind of go here. And then I can also do things when I do that, when I take that off, aligning to the left, justify content start, or to the end, justify content end, because we have a little extra space to play. Whereas before, when I had the grow in, if I bring this back on, even with the justify content end, it makes no difference because the flex one, the grow property, is just filling in all the space. So then justify content doesn't do anything. But I'll put that back to center, and I'll bring this back. And I want to move on next to CSS Grid. Now, before I switch over, I'm just going to scroll down here just so you can see the CSS for the grid layout. And then I'll turn this on. And you notice not much is different yet. And even if I do this shrink here, it kind of does the same thing. But one thing that's a little different between the grid CSS and the flexbox CSS is I defined CSS on the container only. I applied a display grid and then did a gap to maintain 40 pixels between the items. And then I applied this grid template columns with a feature called repeat, which will auto fit. And then in there, I use a property that's exclusive to CSS Grid called min-max. And I know this is kind of nested in here. It's a little tough to read. I'll just expand this out a little bit. But then I put the min where it takes in that min width of 360 and then 100% if the window gets less than 360, so you don't have overflow. And then I tell it to do 1FR, which is another measurement of grid, meaning just fill in any additional space, grow to fill that in, kind of like the flex 1 property. And then for grid auto rows, I just do 1FR just to make sure the heights of them are even. But you can see that there's just overall, there's a lot less CSS I had to write. And there's nothing, again, in any of the items. It's all just being controlled within the container. Okay, so we have these two layout styles, using flexbox or using grid. But why two of them? Why not just use one? Well, there's certain situations where one might be preferable over the other. Now don't get me wrong, you can do layouts all with just flexbox only or with grid only. But in certain situations, one might be a little easier than the other. But anyhow, let's get back into the code and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so back on our grid layout here, I'm going to click this button to hide the sixth item. And as you probably remember earlier, when I did that same thing on Flexbox, we kind of had this happening where the items grew to fill in the extra space. But now, watch what happens when I do it on grid. Kind of get a little bit of that effect that we had with floats, but you notice that these other items aren't expanding. So why is that? Well, how come these items didn't fill in that space like with Flexbox? Well, if we go into our dev tools here, sorry about this. Tricky to select this here. If I highlight this, you notice how on the bottom right, there's sort of this empty space there. It's almost like an empty cell. And with the CSS that I showed earlier, I didn't have any CSS at all on any of the items. It was all within the grid. And what's really happening with grid here is the container is ultimately defining the layout. You can think of it as something that's been predefined, and each of the items have to live within the layout. that grid container defines for it. So it's a much more centrally structured, more centralized control when it comes to flexbox, or I'm sorry, with grid. And with flexbox, the layout is being shaped for the most part by the items, especially when I click that off and they grow and expand. They're just kind of filling independently of the row above it. There's no paying attention from flexbox as far as if, you know, this gap is even, if this is the same width as that below it, because it's just looking at these items and allowing the items to just get as big as, you know, they're defined, and then it's just controlling how it spaces things between it. And if it can't fill in one row, just push it down to the other, not paying attention to the previous row above it. It's just like, you know, just having another flexbox container down here with the wrap, just being able to do it with a lot less HTML markup. So that's kind of a difference overall between grid and flexbox. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to show you guys in this video in regards to different layout techniques that we have with CSS Grid and Flexbox. Now, as far as which one you want to use in certain situations, it's entirely up to you. But what I was hoping to share in this video is give you an idea that in certain situations, using one might be a little bit easier than the other. Now, don't get me wrong. You could do a whole page and a whole big layout with just Flexbox only, or even with grid only. But really what I want to show you here is give you an idea of how both of them work and allow you to see that, you know, in certain situations, again, where one might make it a little easier than the other, especially when you look at how much code you may have to write. Now, what I like to do is use CSS Grid for the overall layout of, say, the cards, or in this case, the images that you saw in there. And then let's say if those images were cards and they had inner elements in there, and I wanted to align things based on how much size or space they took up of those elements, that's when I would use Flexbox. So that's just the way I do it. That's not a particular standard or something that's set in stone. But I just want to give you an idea of kind of the differences and the pros and cons between the two. But anyhow, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to showing you another video soon.